Hello and welcome to another episode of Disasters in History. This week we're going to cover October 27th to November 3rd. And starting out strong, on October 27th, we have the Donora Death Fog. Now, if you look at this picture on my left, your right, this is a photo of Donora in Pennsylvania during the death smog itself, which sounds like a fantastic band name, but it was in fact a disaster. So on October 27th, 1948, a temperature inversion settled in over the town of Donora, Pennsylvania. So real quick, let's explain what a temperature inversion here is with my handy dandy whiteboard. So we have our ground, right? So we got our ground drawn right here. And usually it's kind of like in this particular case, the Donora, Pennsylvania is along the Monongahela River in just outside Pittsburgh. So it's kind of in a bit of a valley, which helps in this situation. Well, it doesn't help, but it makes this situation worse. So the general idea of a temperature inversion is if you look at the atmosphere, temperatures generally get colder the higher you go up in the air, because if you have your sun up here in the atmosphere, you got your sun here. Let's add some rays to our sun. We have our sun. Sun shines down on the ground, produces infrared radiation, shines down. The ground absorbs the vast majority of that radiation and then reflects it back as such. What a lot of people believe is that the sun warms the atmosphere, which then warms the ground. But that is not how this works. It's actually the sun is warming the ground, which is then radiating heat back up into the atmosphere, which is why if you look at an air sounding for usually with severe weather or things like that, you'll see a temperature profile, and that temperature profile gets colder as it goes up. So just to give you an idea of what a sounding looks like is you'll have a red line as such, goes up like this usually, and then on the sides you'll have lines of different layers of pressure, usually anywhere from 300 to 200 millibars at the top, and then usually 925 millibars at the bottom, and then 500 in the middle somewhere, 500. And then at the bottom, you'll have lines that go this direction, like such, that'll be temperatures. So you'll have 0, -5, -10, -15. And this temperature profile will go this direction because as you get higher in the atmosphere, you will have it get colder because you're not getting that radiant heat up from the ground as usual. However, occasionally you will have a warm air mass. Let me erase some of my stuff here. You will have a warmer air mass that's at a higher level, so is a higher level in the atmosphere. Let's just say our warmer air mass is right here. Okay, this red oval right here is our warmer air mass, and it will slide up over the top of a colder air mass. Now, this presents a problem because colder air sinks, warmer air rises, and if you don't have any wind, this warm air doesn't go anywhere, right? So you don't have any mixing of this atmosphere. So anything that sits down here on the ground, such as a car or a plant or a fire or whatever, all of that smoke or pollutants or whatever isn't being mechanically mixed by the changing of air, right? Because normally you have your cold air on top, your warm air on bottom, the warm air will rise up, your cold air will fall, and it'll mix the layers together. But when your warmer air is on top and your colder air is on bottom, there's nothing to make these mix, especially if there is no wind or rain or anything like that. You usually have a mixture. So this will just kind of sit here until something disturbs it, usually wind or rain or something of that nature. Now, this temperature inversion essentially just traps everything below it. There is no mixing. Anything that gets created down here just sits there and waits. So on the day of October 27th, 1948, a temperature inversion settled in over Donora, Pennsylvania. The problem was there were multiple plants that were producing material in Donora. Those material were the Donora Zinc Works and the American Steel and Wire plant. They were both producing zinc and steel and wire, which produces a large amount of very toxic chemicals as byproducts that at the time was being released out of their smokestacks. Unfortunately, those smokestacks do not go nearly high enough into the air to not be able to break it through this inversion. So everything that they produced out of their smokestack just kind of fell towards the ground and filled up the entirety of this inversion. Now, what were they releasing? Well, the material they were producing created high levels of hydrogen fluoride and sulfur dioxide. And because of the inversion, the pollutants created by the plant just never left. This inversion is also what creates fog in the morning. So fogs in the morning is a temperature inversion, and fog doesn't actually burn off, it just evaporates, right? They're just low-level clouds. And because of that temperature inversion, water condenses down here at the ground and then sits. Usually, they will evaporate off from the edges out. If you ever watch a time lapse of fog, it evaporates from the outside in because that thinner layer of the fog on the exterior evaporates first and it slowly dissipates like such. In this case, this temperature inversion just sat there and it didn't allow for that evaporation, that heating to get in to evaporate that fog. The fog, mixed with the hydrogen fluoride and the sulfur dioxide, created an incredibly toxic atmosphere in Donora. By October 28th, the residents of Donora began to cough and wheeze amongst the thick yellow fog. And that's the other thing, is normal fog is, that whitish, darkish, grayish color. This was fully a pea soup yellow. It was a gross color and it just sat there. It spread everywhere throughout town, even getting inside, and no one could escape the horrible fog. By October 29th, no one could drive in town anymore because the fog was so thick. This entire time, both the Zinc Works and the American Steel Plant were still producing material, still pumping all of this material up into the fog and all that, never actually stopped, didn't even think about stopping. And by the 29th, literally no one in town could drive. One person tried to drive and had to drive with their head out the window and were scraping their car along the curb along the side of the road because that is the only way they knew where they were going. Doctors made house calls on foot with a flashlight to guide their way through town. The Donora Fire Chief and Assistant Fire Chief John Volk and Russell Davis carried air packs throughout town to give fresh oxygen to those suffering the most. The only thing keeping those two going from the 29th until rain finally dispersed the fog was a single shot of whiskey when they returned to the fire station. So they went through their entire pack of available oxygen, all of their fire tanks, oxygen tanks for their firefighters. They went through all of two local towns' oxygen tanks. And during that entire time, as they were walking through this fog, they never took their own oxygen. They would just go back to the station, take a shot of whiskey, grab another tank, head back out into the fog. Would come back, grab another shot of whiskey, grab another tank, head back out into the fog. Now, eventually, on October 31st, rain fell over Donora and dispersed the temperature inversion in the fog itself. During the entire effect of the smog, 20 people in town died, and a total of well over 1,000 or 14,000 became ill with respiratory issues. It was basically the entire town. So it was a town of about 14,000, approximately 7,000, became ill with respiratory issues. In the aftermath of the disaster, the death rate would remain higher than elsewhere for decades afterwards. In fact, there were numerous studies done in Donora, and many people had multiple times the lethal dose of fluoride in their system because of this event. Now, throughout the entire incident, the plants did not shut down. In fact, on the morning of October 31st, the town finally banded together to go to the plants and be like, hey, you guys need to stop. Otherwise, this is going to keep happening, and then ended up raining and dispersing. Now, after the disaster, both the Donora Zinc Works and American Steel and Wire, both owned by U.S. Steel, were sued by the townspeople. And Their argument was that it was an act of God and not anything that they could have controlled. So they got away with it. They ended up paying some settlement, but it was barely any money whatsoever, and continued to work there for decades before eventually shutting down and polluting the town. In fact, there was an area around the zinc works in particular where no plants would grow because there was so much pollutants in the area that it killed all of the plants. So that is the Donora Death Smog, which is a wild disaster and is a fantastic band name. Our next disaster is the Baku Metro Fire. On October 28, 1995, a subway train consisting of 5 passenger cars was traveling to Baku, Azerbaijan, with at least 600 people in total aboard the trains. As they were moving through the tunnel, a fire began in the rear of the 4th car due to an electrical fault. This electrical fault caused the train to come to a full stop about 200 meters, 600 or so feet from the subway station. Passengers in car 4 saw white smoke followed quickly by heavy black smoke. Many of the passengers attempted to exit the car but could not get the doors open, so resorted to breaking windows to escape. The driver of the subway requested the power turned off to the rails, but this was not done, so numerous people were severely electrocuted and died attempting to grab a hold of rails and cables to escape. In addition to this, someone changed the ventilation system in the tunnel to exhaust, most likely in a belief this would clear the smoke to help passengers escape, but it only drew the smoke in the direction of evacuation, causing numerous passengers to die while outside of the train itself. In total, somewhere around 300 people would die, the vast majority of them trapped inside the subway cars themselves, but 40 would die of a combination of electrocution and smoke inhalation on the exterior of the subway, including 3 rescuers who would die of electrocution from accidentally touching the rail while it was still electrified. Our next disaster was October 29th, 2012. Hurricane Sandy. Now, Hurricane Sandy began as a tropical wave just south of Jamaica on October 22nd, 2012, before quickly organizing into a tropical storm and then a Category 2 hurricane before making initial landfall near Kingston, Jamaica, killing 2 people. It then emerged offshore and strengthened into a Category 3 hurricane before making landfall in Cuba, killing 11 people and causing extensive storm surge damage. It then moved northward before making landfall again near Brigantine, New Jersey on October 29th. As the storm moved ashore, it caused significant coastal flooding up and down the east coast of the United States, despite being officially no longer tropical by the time it made landfall. One of the most interesting parts of Hurricane Sandy is its massive size. Gale force winds, approximately 40 to 55 miles per hour, stretched 1,150 miles across the entire eastern seaboard, causing significant power outages and damage. In total, 160 people in the United States died due to the storm. Now, if you look at this map here, you can kind of see the outline of right along here. This is North Carolina right here. And then right here, you have the Delmarva Peninsula. This would be New Jersey right here. And then you go up along this direction. Staten Island is right in this general area. You move up. The center of the storm is right here. It is all the way down almost to this South Carolina border right here. This is Florida going down here. This is an absolute massive storm, and it caused major problems all up and down the eastern seaboard, especially in New Jersey and New York and New York City. I remember going to New York City just in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, and it was some of the most interesting, I guess is the word I would use, damage I've ever seen. It's rare to see storm surge damage and flooding damage in a major city like that. So it's one of those things that really sticks with you. Now, our next disaster is an interesting one, and it's one of the wildest ones I've ever covered. There aren't any really good pictures for this one, although this was in newspapers at the time. So on October 30th, 1858, a sweet maker in Bradford, England, accidentally sold approximately 1,000 lozenges that contained large amounts of arsenic trioxide. So the story here is a few days earlier, a man by the name of William Hardiker, otherwise known as Humbug Billy, was due to receive a delivery of peppermint sweets from a confectioner named Joseph Neal. Now, the sweets were supposed to be made of peppermint oil, sugar, water, and gum, but sugar was incredibly expensive, so Neal would substitute the sugar with gypsum powder. Yes, basically plaster. The problem was, Neal had run out of gypsum to put in his lozenges, so he sent another man to buy some from a druggist. When he arrived, the druggist, Charles Hodgson, was sick in bed, so Hodgson sent his assistant, William Goddard, upstairs to get the gypsum with the instructions that it was in a wooden barrel. Now, it's unknown if anyone looked in the window seat or down in the basement to see if maybe there was a dead body there, but no matter what, Goddard was met upstairs with two identical wooden barrels. Both barrels had a white powder in them. Not deciding to investigate any further and just assuming that both had the same thing in them, he pulled 5 kilograms of the white powder from one of them and gave it to the man. He brought it back to Neal, who made it into a lozenge, but noticed the mixture was a darker color and smoother than normal. Thinking it was just an off batch, he continued on working with it, occasionally tasting it to make sure it tasted right. Eventually, Neal and his assistant both fell sick and started vomiting, which they both attributed to cholera, as there was a major cholera pandemic in England at the time. Not being deterred by the random violent vomiting, they continued to make the candies and eventually sold them to Humbug Billy. He picked them up, noticed they were a weird color, and managed to negotiate a lower price for them, which they agreed to, probably partially because they were tired of vomiting and didn't really think straight. Humbug Billy began selling them that evening and started to eat some before becoming ill and violently vomiting and going home. Humbug Billy's assistant continued selling the candy until around 11:30 p.m. and sold around 1,000 in total. The next day, people began to die. Authorities initially blamed it on that cholera outbreak, but quickly determined the sickness was connected to the candies because numerous people started to die quickly, and it was way too many people to be getting sick that quickly at the same time from cholera. They went back to the druggist and was shown the cask that the powder was pulled from. Picking it up and looking at the bottom was labeled arsenic. Neal, Goddard, and Hodgson were arrested for negligent manslaughter, but were eventually acquitted and the incident was ruled an accident. One of the doctors who treated the people for arsenic poisoning went ahead and sent one of the candies to a chemist and determined that it had approximately 580 milligrams of arsenic, which is well beyond the amount required to kill an adult. 20 people, either 21 or 20 people died in the poisoning. Sources differ vaguely on which amount there were, and well over 200 ended up sick with arsenic poisoning. None of the bodies were alleged to have been hiding in a window seat, and it eventually led to the passage of the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860 in the United Kingdom, which was supposed to punish people for mixing in things that were not normally edible into food. Things like plaster, because sugar was expensive, so replacing the sugar with plaster made it so that they could make significantly more of it and make more money off of it. Although the actual bill itself, or the law itself, I should say, was more or less ineffective because there was essentially no punishment for doing any of it. So it kind of just went along. Although I did hear that arsenic mixed with elderberry wine is incredibly tasty. Our next disaster this week is the Indiana State Fairground explosion. On October 31st, 1963, yes, Halloween Day, leaking propane tanks in the Indiana State Fairground Coliseum filled a space below the southeastern corner of the grandstand in Indianapolis, Indiana. Approximately 4,400 spectators had gathered in the Coliseum to watch Holiday on Ice. At 11:03 p.m., just as the grand finale was about to start, the cloud of propane gas reached a popcorn burner and ignited, causing a large gas explosion that launched several hundred people and several thousand pounds of concrete up into the air and onto the ice. The first explosion weakened a load-bearing wall, which caused a small collapse, dropping people down into the hole that was made by the initial explosion. Then, a few minutes later, a second explosion occurred that injured even more people. The second explosion was other propane tanks down in the actual storage area that eventually exploded from the fire caused by the initial explosion. Throughout the entire disaster, the Holiday on Ice Orchestra continued to play music to help with the evacuation. In total, 81 people died in the disaster, making it one of the deadliest disasters in Indiana history. Now, one of the interesting things about this particular disaster is because it was Halloween night, the Indiana State Police had put out significantly more police officers to prepare for shenanigans by youths throughout Indianapolis. And it ended up not being needed because it was raining so hard that night that most of the youths of Indianapolis decided to stay home and not cause mischief. But they decided to keep the state police officers on. So when the explosion happened, there was one sitting in the parking lot of the state fairgrounds who immediately called backup and was able to have numerous police officers, numerous ambulances, and all of that there incredibly quickly. Now, because the Indiana State Fairgrounds Coliseum had an ice rink in the middle of it and Holiday on Ice was being performed on the ice rink, they actually took many of the dead from the disaster and just laid them on the ice and put a blanket over top of them and used the ice as a temporary morgue while they tried to evacuate those who were injured. In the aftermath of the disaster, multiple people were charged, but none of them actually ended up serving any jail time. They either had their charges dropped or overturned. Several of those were the state fire marshal who inspected the State Fairground Coliseum and approved storing propane tanks in a completely sealed room, which is always a terrible idea. The actual people in charge of filling the gas tanks were charged, but they eventually ended up getting off. In fact, part of the problem is that during the initial investigation, the propane tanks that didn't explode were completely emptied of all of their propane in order to transport them elsewhere to have them tested. The problem was one of the beliefs of the cause of this disaster is that the gas company way overfilled the propane tanks, which allowed them to leak, which caused it to eventually build up enough gas to cause the explosion. But because all of that propane was released, they didn't really have anything to investigate. This did lead to some changes in fire codes, mostly that you can't store propane in an enclosed area anymore, which feels like it should have been a thing that was already well known, but I guess we needed to learn that one the hard way. And then our final disaster this week is the Club Cinq-Sept fire in Saint-Laurent-du-Pont, France. On November 1st, 1970, in Saint-Laurent-du-Pont, France, around 180 individuals had gathered together in Club Cinq-Sept to hear the band The Storm perform a concert. This was a very popular band in France in the 1970s. At around 1:40 a.m., a fire began in the second story of the club and quickly spread along the polyurethane foam-covered ceilings and papier-mâché decorations in the club. Now, at the time, in order to prevent people from sneaking into the club without paying, because they were incredibly worried that people were going to skip out on the 5 franc cover charge, they did what most club owners do, and they locked the emergency exits with padlocks. But they felt like that wasn't enough to keep people from sneaking in, so they also nailed them shut with boards, leaving the only possible exit that anyone in the club knew about, a pair of turnstiles at the entrance. Because of the build of these turnstiles, only one could be used to exit and only fit one person at a time. Now, this isn't like the turnstiles at, if you're in the U.S. or Midwest in the U.S., the turnstiles at Menards, where it's a bar that just kind of spins. These are like more or less metal revolving doors. So let's pull up my whiteboard here real quick. We'll do this real quick and explain this. So if you've been in a Menards in the Midwest, it's a hardware store for those who are not in the Midwest. There are turnstiles at the entrance that are like this. They're kind of like subways. You walk through this direction and they spin around like this, right? They're only about 2.5, 3 feet tall. Your mid-thigh hits this and spins it around. That's not what these were. These turnstiles were more like revolving doors. So you have your spinning middle portion right here, right? These are full size all the way up to the ceiling. You have your spinning middle portion. And then there are 3 sections that have metal bars that stick out like this, right? All the way on both sides. And then, in order to prevent people from going back against the flow, there is a second bar that doesn't rotate that sits off to the side, and it has bars that stick out into the middle of these other bars all the way across, so you can't sneak in. So when you're walking through this, you're walking through this side here, like such, and it's spinning around this direction. So you can't go back this direction because there's these bars in the way. That is what was at the entrance of the club Cinq-Sept. There were 2 sets of these. There was one for the entrance, and then there was one going out for the exit. Now, because the fire started on the 2nd floor, the entire ceiling, all the way up top, the whole thing was covered with polyurethane acoustic foam, all the way across the top. But where they had where the fire started were these little alcoves that had been made to look like essentially caves. They had been placed with acoustic foam, of course, because it's a nightclub. Of course, there's acoustic foam, but they'd also had installed these paper mache giant rocks to make it look more like a cave. And so when the fire really got going, it started burning into the cushions of the chairs up there, as well as in the paper mache, and then rocketed across the top of the ceiling. Now, of course, people went back. If you've listened to me talk about disasters, a lot of people in fires go to the place where they entered because that's the first exit they think of. So a lot of people ran towards those turnstiles. And when they got to those turnstiles, a crowd crush quickly formed as too many individuals attempted to escape at once. There was also an emergency exit right there by the turnstiles, was locked, boarded shut. Now, one of the owners managed to escape out a side door along with approximately 40 guests that watched him go through the bar. So they had to jump over the bar and then go out the door. The problem was the actual club itself didn't have a phone. So in order to get the fire department there, the owner had to run 10 minutes to the fire station to get help. When the fire department arrived on scene, there was minimal smoke showing, and the scene was almost silent. There was no flames showing. There was minimal smoke. There was no screaming. There was none of that. There were some people standing around outside, but there wasn't really anything going on, and they believed most of the club guests had escaped. Problem was, they couldn't get inside the building because the emergency exits were locked. Once they finally forced the door, they found an absolute nightmare inside. In fact, several firefighters were reported to have thrown up. Several immediately started crying and exited the building. They found piles of people 4 to 5 feet high of bodies that had fused to the door because it got so hot inside the building. In total, 146 people died in the fire. There were approximately 180 to 190, which means about the vast majority of people inside this building died. Now, this particular fire has one of the most poignant memorials I have ever seen. In the location of where the building was, there is this granite memorial that has the names of all of the deaths inside the building. But on the back side, if you look just behind it, you see this right here. Those are the turnstiles that were at the entrance of the club. And on the turnstiles, there is a plaque that reads in French, "Placed in the entrance hall, these turnstiles made by unconscious and money-hungry men caused the death of 146 young people burned alive on November 1st, 1970. Now, in the aftermath of the disaster, one of the owners, there were 3 owners of the club, 2 of the owners died in the fire itself, but the one owner who escaped, Gilbert Boss, would be charged with 146 counts of involuntary manslaughter. He would receive a 2-year suspended sentence, and that would be it. Now, in the aftermath of the fire, there were numerous fire codes that were updated related to nightclubs and all of that, and its requirements for escape routes and all of that throughout France. And with that, we've reached the end of this week's episode. Remember to like, subscribe, comment. You guys know you're adults. You know how to use YouTube. Thank you to our members. You guys are awesome. I appreciate the support. And as always, everyone stay safe and remember to check your smoke detector batteries.